All right, let's talk a little bit about editing because editing is really the key to your success as a writer. It's one thing to be able to write, but it really takes a special eye to be able to see how to make other people's writing better. So, the joke here is, what is editing? Well, editing is changing other people's copy, but the goal is to make that copy be better than it was before, not necessarily just to change it for change's sake. We don't want it to sound like us as the editor. We want it to sound like the writer, but there's certain things that need to be changed. We need to tighten. We need to elaborate. We need to fix grammar and spelling and AP style. All of these things fall under editing. So, a good editor has passion for these kind of things. Obviously, grammar, spelling, style, punctuation, but really a love of writing. The ability to look at a story and say, hey, this is how I can make the story better. This is where we need to strengthen things. This is where we need to, change our word choice. And really, that's going to be what helps us become better editors. Um, we really want you to be able to think concisely, and I think you'll agree over here at the right, this is not concise because we have to get information across to readers who don't have a lot of time, don't want to spend a lot of time. So we really need to tighten things up, say what we mean what we say. A knowledge of design is helpful to be able to see how things go together, understanding legal issues, the taste of your publication, even a little bit of skepticism, be able to see, hey, is this story really what it's intended to be? Are these sources really telling us what we need to know? Really to be able to look at that story as objectively as possible and do what it needs to make it better. You have to be able to see cynicism and double meanings. You need to be able to see, like this headline, I mean, no kidding, right? You need to have self-confidence in your own writing to be able to improve other people's writing. But this is not, as I said, making someone's writing sound like yours. It's reading it through, seeing where it has holes, seeing where it needs to be tightened, seeing where it needs to be, have grammatical or stylistic fixes. It's taking responsibility for someone else's story, and even more importantly, it's working anonymously. Editors don't get a lot of awards. We don't, identify editors in the byline. Your job behind the scenes as an editor is to make your writers look good. So the first thing I really encourage you to do is to read the story and do that all the way through before you ever start to edit anything, because your answers may actually be further in the story. So read it all the way through, then edit it thoroughly, and that's making all of the changes that you feel that it needs, and then read it back through again to make sure it makes sense. And be careful, writing headlines like these to make sure they make sense as well. Remember this sentence: if it doesn't make sense to you, it does not make sense. So, a lot of times what young editors will do is they'll say, well, it didn't make sense to me, but, I think that's what the reader meant to do, or this is what I think they meant. If it's not making sense, it's not going to make sense to the reader either. So you need to make sure to be on top of that and make it so that it does make sense. The 3 R's of copy editing is got to be reader-centered, so focused on the reader. It has to be readable, and it has to be right. We have to make sure this information is correct. So this is what reader-centered is. It's the story focused on what the reader wants to know. Is this story new for the reader? Is it something that's going to get across to the reader that is going to be important to them and have some significance? Is the main point clear? Is it answering the questions that the reader's going to have in the order that they have them? So as soon as a reader has a question, we should be answering that right away. Are there loose ends that are tied up, or do you sort of have something hanging out there and then you're like, that just goes away into nothing? Is it arranged logically so that it's a clear narrative flow? You're going to fix all of those things as an editor. We're looking at concise, or things that are irrelevant. Can we use more simple words? Can we live without any words or paragraphs and not lose the meaning of the story? Do the quotes add something? Should we make them paraphrases and tighten them up a little bit? All these things are an editor's job. We got to be accurate and objective, and at the same time we have to look at the legal, ethical, and really sensitivity roles of what's acceptable for our community. We have to look at inconsistencies and what's our spelling like. Remember, don't mess with Texas. Is the style consistent? Do we have the same style throughout? The tenses, a lot of people will go between present and past tense. We have to correct those. Are there typos, grammatical issues? All of these things are come into play when you look at a story. There is a difference between proofreading and copy editing. So proofreading is what you do after the story's been edited. You edit the story first, and that's really adjusting the content, manipulating the actual story itself. And then proofreading is fixing any spelling, style errors, any really glaring errors. And this is where we're going to go back through and make sure that we don't have words left out, we have AP style, all of that. This is just a little checklist I've given you to kind of keep an eye on some things that you need to worry about when you're checking for editing, and this should be among the last things that you're checking for right before you send the story through. Try to make sure that figures add up, that things aren't inconsistent, especially from previous stories. So just because something was published once doesn't mean it was right the first time. Make sure you double check, triple check all your numbers. Things like first, biggest, only, or it's a record. You got to make sure that stuff is true. So don't put that in there just to have it. Keep an eye on quotes. Do they sound like they're authentic quotes? Do they sound like they're, maybe, I don't know, fabricated from the author? Do they sound like maybe they're not exactly what their source would have said? Facts that aren't necessarily facts, news that isn't news. So the first thing you're checking is, does this story have news value to it? Are things imprecise? Are people using words the way they should be? Make sure that you're checking all of that. AP style, going to be a big part of what you do. Double checking math, making sure that the numbers you're not just throwing in a bunch of numbers, that they actually have some context behind them. And then quoting versus paraphrasing is one of the biggest places that an editor is going to make mistakes. They're going to doctor quotes to make them better. They're going to write headlines without reading the story, and they're going to rewrite when they shouldn't. Not all copy needs to be rewritten. And, making a mistake in someone else's copy is worse in a lot of ways than making it in your own. So be very responsible when you're doing this. Make sure that you follow these guidelines, and we're going to help make each other's work better in every story.